So my name is Sean Chabot, and I just want to welcome everybody. Huge crowd, which is very exciting for us. I want to thank the organizers who've done an amazing job, especially Sundi, Musniki, and Stacy. And also thank people who are filming this event. So there are times in history when we must speak fearlessly against the direction our society is going, when silence in the face of evil is betrayal. In 1967, after winning the Nobel Prize and global fame, Martin Luther King gave a speech entitled, "Beyond Vietnam, Time to Break Silence," that connected the struggle against domestic racism with the struggle against US militarism around the world. As King, whose birthday we'll celebrate on Monday, said, "Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that's appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak." And after explaining his views on the war in Vietnam in quite a bit of detail, he concluded, "We still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight." Today, we often forget that this speech made him a hated figure in the American mainstream, among elites, journalists, and even other black leaders. And it was no coincidence that Martin Luther King was killed exactly 1 year after that speech. Although the world has changed dramatically in the past 50 years, Majid and I feel that we're once again living in a time to break the silence, a time when we must speak fearlessly and make a choice between coexistence and co-annihilation. Today, the war on terror that our government started in 2001 is increasingly coming home to roost in the form of domestic terrorism. Just like the war in Vietnam led to domestic cycles of violence in the late 1960s. While there's a long tradition of Islamophobia in US politics and culture, anti-Muslim rhetoric and attacks are rising to new heights, especially since the heated race for the president started and the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino. As presidential candidates have normalized hate speech against the Muslim other, hate crimes like mosque burnings and assaults against students identified as Muslims occur at higher rates than ever. How are global and domestic forms of brutal violence connected today? Why do we see Muslims as the main enemy in 2016, similar to the way we castigated the Japanese during World War II and communists during the Cold War? Where do we go from here? As most of you know from previous events, can't find them right now, but as most of you know from previous events, nobody at Eastern is better able to address these crucial existential questions than my beloved friend and colleague, Majid Sharifi. But before giving him the stage and the microphone, let me briefly explain the format of today's public dialogue on domestic terrorism in Islam. First, of course, to frame and inspire our thinking, we'll start with Majid's presentation, which will take, hopefully, about 40 minutes. As moderator, I'll listen carefully and interrupt his talk several times with questions that arise. So we're changing modes a little bit. Be him presenting, and I'll be a little bit like an interviewer. As you're listening, please write your questions on index cards. That should be, people should have index cards that they can pass to you, and give them to one of our assistants walking around. Then the second half of the panel is devoted to your questions and participation. We'll first allow a special guest from Lewis and Clark High School to share her story and tell her truth. Then Majid and I will discuss some of the questions you wrote on index cards, and if we have sufficient time, we'll open up the floor for spontaneous questions and free-flowing dialogue. So if all goes well, we hope that this will lead to future panels on this very important subject, really this existential issue confronting us at this time. And so now, without further delay, please give a warm welcome to our fearless speaker, Majid Sharifi.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Without delay, let's just go to a clip that I prepared or I have, and then we go from there. Show it, please, and then I start.
بس كيف رح ياخذ الشهاده اذا كمشوني؟ هذا هدفنا. بعد ما تقتل الكفار كلهم سلم نفسك. ساعتها بنعوز الله القوانين تبعهم، المحاميين تبعهم، الاخبار، التلفزيون، كله نوصل رسالتنا للعالم كله. ساعتها هذا طريقنا الوحيد للسمع.
My name's Dan Finelli. Send me to Washington, and I'll send our enemies where they belong, and that's not to a courtroom. Does this look like a terrorist or this? It's time to stop this political correctness and the invasion of our privacy. Let's face it, if a good-looking, ripped guy without much hair was flying airplanes into the Twin Towers, I'd have no problem being pulled out of line at the airport. This is an airplane. And this is a terrorist. Send me to Washington and get rid of that bum Alan Grayson, and I'll make sure guys like this get nowhere near things like this. I'm Dan Finelli, and I approve this message.
Well, of course, I understand, and all of you understand, that this is a crude example of how political entrepreneurs, in fact, reduce very complex issues into reductionistic, simple answers. Finelli's purpose is obvious here. We don't really need to explore that. Two of them is maybe too much. It's obvious here. He taps into the current Islamophobia to achieve his political goal, which is to get to the seat of power. It's a simple argument that all of us understand. But what Finelli does here is not so different from, and this is provocative to say, but I'm afraid that it is true, what the fascists and Nazis did back in the 1930s. At the time, it was the fascist propaganda machines of the Germans who appealed to the most primordial emotions of Germans to motivate them, to mobilize them against Jews, communists, and liberals. By appealing, of course, by then, the Germans had come to believe that these people, this group of people, actually are their existential enemies. I'm afraid that history is repeating itself in some ways, hopefully not, if we have something to do with it. As more and more political entrepreneurs, or should I say political prostitutes, like Finelli, there are many of them, this is a crude example, but the content we have to worry about, not the framing or the crudeness of this ad. These political prostitutes are doing pretty much what the German Nazi machine did, creating fear and fear-mongering to appeal to the most primordial emotions of people, which is survival. And that's normal. When you are in a mode of survival, you are not in the mode of normal democratic politics. And of course, the reason I'm comparing these two together is the idea that there are a set of common technologies, let's call it political technologies, that all fear-mongers, in fact, invoke. Let's look at a few of them. For sure, fear-mongering, I talked about it, is the idea that we talked about. Political othering, of course. fear-mongering cannot happen unless you create a sense of us versus them. But again, a part of othering, constitutive of othering, must be creation and production of a sense of hyper-nationalism. The idea that the country belongs to a few, blacks, whites, whatever, Muslims, Christians, a certain, so creating a sort of parochial view of nationalism and imposing it, superimposing it upon the whole. The idea you've heard it like, love it or leave it. And of course, it's not only us that we say it, or some people here say it in this country, love it or leave it, has been invoked in Italy, in France, in Britain, and in other countries. So, and the final point, securitization, or we could say politics of security. That is when an issue, an event, a conflict, an idea is politicized into existential enemy. And right there and then, of course, it creates a different apparatus, a state that appeals and focuses on security politics, and security politics becomes total and totalizing by its very function and nature becomes a different sort of the state. It's no longer democratic. It can't be democratic. Of course, this we know that it was very familiar concept even to the founding fathers of this country. For example, we know, perhaps many of you have heard Benjamin Franklin saying that those who give up liberty for security, they deserve none. And of course, the same idea was repeated by FDR right after World War I, not even actually World War I, in 1941, in his very famous speech, Freedom from Fear, where he was afraid of, again, fear-mongers. And what he said was, of course, we shouldn't fear from fear. But it is amazing now that 60 years later, we have come to a point that, in fact, the political establishment in this country is conducting a war based on fear itself. Not the political motivations behind it and all the complexities attached to it, but reducing it to the soundbite of war on terrorism. In this context, it is not so surprising that political entrepreneurs are competing with each other, and it's very obvious, as Sean said, competing with each other right now to show off who can better fight this so-called terrorism. Meanwhile, the very concept of terrorism, I believe, and I contend, and that's my theory and my purpose for this discussion is very vague. We really don't know what it means and what it does. What are the political motivations? And this is what we should be afraid of. I just make a very small example here. The example of what happened back in 2015, December of 2015, not too long ago. That the possible threat of a bomb sends, in this context, officials into panic. A bomb threat in Southern California compelled public officials to close a huge school district. Now, this non-event turned into a national crisis. And it created more debates and reinforced the same context in the sense that, of course, it became the tools, the means for political entrepreneurs, again, to compete on the issue of who can fight terrorism better. And it was actually non-event. It's absurd, but it was. And of course, it became the fuel for the media. And also a great agenda for the security military-industrial complex. In other words, more than anything else, it shaped the consciousness or the conversation of the nation around whether we should go on and walk on the path of securitization, more securitization, militarization, or the path to democracy. And so this is where we are right now. And to summarize my point is that if any time we reduce complex socio-political phenomenon like terrorism, modern terrorism, especially these days, which is not isolated from the globalized world and the context in which it is being created. If we reduce it to the issues of security and how to fight it, how many allies we have, how many bombers, how many bombings, and all these other lists that we have, we really fail to understand it, first of all. Second of all, we fail to understand the democracy. It's got implication for our democracy. And with this, having said that, this is my plan for the talk, with this introduction, with this background. I want to focus on how most Americans, not all, have come to understand terrorism today through certain frameworks, certain analytical frameworks. And mostly I want to deconstruct these frameworks to see if they are really myth or not. I want to see if they are really blinders or windows through which we can see better. In my opinion, these frameworks are in fact blinders. And in order to understand terrorism, at least let alone fighting it, we must take off this veil, this darkness. And so long as we haven't taken off these lenses, I'm not so sure we can fight terrorism. So here, this is a political talk. It's not about military, and it's not about how to kill one terrorist, how to take over one hill, how to take over whatever it is that it needs to be done. That's a different discussion for a different day. This is about us and democracy and the security surveillance apparatus of the state. So against this background, I want to just focus on how Islam has become, in fact, the framework and Islamification of terrorism. It's a process. Yes, it has a history behind it, but Islamification of terrorism is really important. So with this, I want to focus how Islam has been connected and related to to terrorism. How did we get here? The very idea, what is Islamic terrorism? Why did it just pick up that idea, that connection, that linkage? You wanted to say
Okay.
something? I'm sorry.
No, before, Majid, before you continue, and I want to just address this idea of democracy, and especially this idea of fear-mongering, right? So mongering, in general, means selling fear. But it's, I think, very important for us to think about, well, people can sell things, even political prostitutes, I guess like other prostitutes, can sell things, but it doesn't mean we necessarily have to buy them, right? So why is it that we actually, as educated, many educated Americans, why do we actually buy this kind of way of seeing and responding to people identified as Muslims in our society? So maybe if you could say a few words about that before you go into the framework.
Yeah, the idea of why selling fear is connected to buying it. Yeah, very complex issue, obviously, and my answer would be I will be alluding to it. I would say that everything, as you and I know, and everybody in this room know, everything is political in a sense. We don't come to understand concepts in a vacuum. The language in which we speak, obviously, you agree, is loaded with narratives. And those narratives are a part and parcel of our existence, our reality. And historically, without really going through it too much, historically, Islam and the Orient and the colonized and the savages and the uncivilized have been connected. So it's not so surprising that we are here where we are. But where we go from here, I think, is more important. And it has something to do with our will. That's why I created or sort of framed this discussion around 3 different political analytical frameworks through which most Americans have come to understand terrorism. Let's go over those. And from here, first thing for me, I think it's important to explain how terrorism has been Islamicized. It's really important. Why? Why Christianity is not? Why Judaism is not? Why Hinduism is not? Or Buddhism and all of that? Why Islam? And how? More importantly, looking at what's going on. First, before doing anything, let's just define terrorism. So we have a kind of working definition. Terrorism means the use of violence by non-state actors for a political purpose. In that sense, it's very obvious that we understand that terrorism and terrorists have political motivations. And if they have political motivation, we must understand the political motivation behind acts of terrorism. But in general, when we Islamicize terrorism, we kind of mask all of those different motivations into non-existence. And of course, it hurts us. And it hurts others. And let me just make a couple of examples, and you are very familiar with it. We know Al-Qaeda, its political objective is very clear. It wants to use random violence on the soft targets in order to force the United States out of the Middle East. So it attacks U.S. interests and Western interests all over the world wherever it can. This we know, and this is a political motivation. But on the other hand, we can see ISIS, which came from Al-Qaeda, has a different political motivation. Its political motivation is to establish a local, regional state in there, on the one hand, so it is territorial and national, or nationalistic, in a sense. But it has also a global vision, and that is to fight, to create, to trigger, to provoke a clash of civilization. This is its political aim. And in the similar vein, we see Hamas, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and maybe non-ISIS Syrian terrorists, many of them with different names. We can talk about it later in the discussion. Also, their political aim is territorial and nationalistic. KKK, no, I'm sorry, not KKK, PKK, the Kurdish group, they have a political game. It's territorial and ethno-nationalistic. We have to understand that. We have to understand these differences. But it seems that we don't. Why? Most of the time, we know that many of these media-appointed experts of terrorism, in fact, associate all terrorists with jihadists, and since terrorism is violent and brutal and savage in its very function and nature and appearance and real and reality, and then, of course, jihad and Islam is the same. Jihad is a word in Islam. Certainly, that connection is created. the Islamic terrorism. And of course, they invoke jihad all the time, and jihadists, as if jihad itself can tell us something about the political motivation among all of these actors. Meanwhile, in Arabic, just most of you know it, but in Arabic we know that the word jihad literally means struggle. And this struggle could mean against physical self-defense, in defense of one's human dignity, in defense of one's communal values, in defense of self-temptation, and also in building of or defense of material needs of the community. For example, in Iran, the organization which is in charge of building roads, bridges, infrastructures, it's called Jihad Sazandagi, which means the struggle to build. So it's a non-political sense, but jihad has been securitized and politicized and associated with, linked with terrorism, at least in our lenses. And that is one of the processes of many processes. I can't go through this deconstruction too deeply, obviously, into the creation of this idea that Islam is the same as terrorists. All terrorists are jihadis. Jihadis is Islamic. Therefore, this combination, this vagueness that can't tell us politically who we are fighting. Their name is the same, perhaps, but it kind of vague for us to do this. And of course, I argue to understand, if we want to understand it, certainly we have to deconstruct these ideas. And from there, I wanna talk about this idea. So if we accept, in a very short, brief way, this connection, which is more in the language than reality, it's more conceptual, it's more fictive than real or actual. It's certainly so ahistorical and uninformed. But this connection exists. And it is a part of the mainstream media. Not only media, but among the mainstream political scientists. Not political scientists, I would say political entrepreneurs, I'm sorry. And if we accept that then there is an association now has been created in the language between Islam and violence and brutality and irrationality and savagery, these ideas, we can understand that these imageries are no different, and especially in the Middle East, no different from those that the colonial powers used for hundreds of years to civilize the Orientals. So this is kind of connected to what you were talking about, how the present is connected unintentionally, inadvertently connected to the past.
Can I ask another question? Because you mentioned colonialism, and colonialism was always based on sort of the civilized, and then they're fighting and trying to keep at bay the barbarians, right, invading. Like in Europe, we talk about the Moors, but there are many stories about the civilized fighting the barbarians, and obviously the barbarians are connected with the savagery. But the question is, why do we feel such moral outrage when we hear about, let's say, beheadings, or we hear about very visible and physical forms of terrorism or terrorist attacks? But at the same time, when we hear about, for instance, droning, right, armed drone attacks, we basically don't respond the same way, and in many ways we actually think that's actually smart strategy, right? I think there's recently a drone report that came out that basically said, that shows that this has been Obama administration's strategy, and nobody, I think, across the political spectrum has even tried to go there, right? Has tried to say, hey, let's not do the droning because they're so deadly. So can you sort of bring it down to sort of this concrete idea of why do we react one way to sort of the barbaric acts of the Muslim other, but then we actually, in many ways, justify or rationalize or normalize our smart strategies of drone attacks.
Yes, I can do that, but I believe, let's go to the next slide. And I think in response to your question, I want to show really how, let me just go back one step. You know, and everybody knows, that of course there is, behind the brutal act of, let's say, drone attacks, bombings, raids, US raids, night raids, in brutal sanctions, there is a political purpose, isn't it? I believe if we focus on those brutality itself, for right now, at least limited to our discussion, it can't tell us much. For example, we all know that the brutal sanction on Iraqis in 2000, the brutal sanction in Iraq that lasted something like 13 years after the first Gulf War, was responsible for the death of 500,000 people. You can't find something as brutal as that. It's savagery, in my opinion. But here is the point, though. If we really want to understand US foreign policy, or even the United States military objective, or US political objective, can that tell us much? I don't think so. Because that brutality is occurring, and it's got its own rationality. So, not that it's not important. Of course we have to understand it. But to understand that brutality of all of US wars, and every war, so US is not unique in that. We cannot just focus on the savagery. But ironically, here is kind of related to the question. Ironically, to understand terrorism for us, we focus only on the savagery that they provide. A very shallow, cursory look at the media every day. What we see is that these brutal people are beheading others. And acts of rapes and tortures and viciousness becomes the focus of analyzing the actors and their political objectives. Or, I should say, the political objective of these actors disappears, and the focus is only on savagery. And then this creates, of course, the idea that these people are so irrational, as if their political objectives are out of the question. We don't really need to know what they need. We don't need even to look at the circumstances and causes of this brutality. No, nothing. All we need to do is just kill them, because they're no longer qualified as human beings. And that is a dangerous thing. But even a shallow looking at, let's say, ISIS's objective. ISIS's objective is very, very clear. In fact, it was written in a book penned by Abu Bakr al-Naji. Let me, yes. This book, the title of the book is demonstrative of Naji's political objective. It says that, of course, when you read the whole thing, it says, produce maximum fear with minimum resources. Why? Because that's how ISIS wants it. Shock local population into submission. It has done that. Certainly provoke Western powers to more bombing or more occupation. Why? Knowing that people and their bombing and occupation get to hate the bombers and occupier a whole lot more than any regime that is at the local level, regardless of their brutality. The third objective is to raise the cost on the West the United States and its Western allies in the region. And it has done that. Just one example is clear here. It cost Al-Qaeda only $400,000 to $500,000 to organize the attack in New York. In response to it, the United States so far has spent $4 to $5 trillion and counting. That is 10 million times more. That is not accounting for all the cost in Egypt, in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Iraq, and all the rest. Because we're not counting those costs. But we must remember that is a cost on humanity, on civilization, on us and them. So, finally, the fourth objective of Naji, which is most important than anything else, he wants to trigger a clash of civilization because that would reinforce his political objective. And this is ironic, I should say tragedy, that many of the political entrepreneurs in this country already think that we are in a clash of civilization. Therefore, the only objective is to win it. But this is not a winnable war. We shouldn't fall into the ISIS logic. ISIS logic is not good for us. Certainly, if we fall into that logic, we would be no different from ISIS. And that brings the brutality and savagery. That makes a difference between. And going back to your question, of course, we know, all of us know, that the political objective of the United States is to hide, to conceal, to sanitize its brutality. Why? Because the brutality is not the political objective of, in fact, the United States policy. It's dumb to think that, U.S. love to bomb us, bomb them, bomb Muslims. That's ridiculous, isn't it? And some people, of course, say that. They make it as, of course, all of those people, ISIS and many people, anti-Western values. They would think pretty much along the same line I said. It is as there is a great Satan out there, which is, again, another form of essentialization. And this takes me takes me to the second framework. So my point here is, don't focus on savagery, even though savagery exists, in order to analyze terrorism. Don't focus on that. The second take, of course, is blaming Muslims by essentializing Islam. This lens tells us that Islam is inherently violent, irrational, misogynist. We've seen all kinds of things. This view essentializes Islam in a sense that it creates an image as if Muslims have had the same fixed behavior or patterns of behavior for thousands of years. What is the supporting evidence for this claim, which is so dominant in the mass media? It is to compare Islam and Muslim to what's written in the text. But that's not a good methodological way. It really is not. It's not at all a good way to understand Muslims or terrorism or Islam or anything else. In fact, if we were to evaluate if we were to evaluate any historical text, the Bible, the Torah, even the Constitution of the United States, today, according to our norms, today's norm, none of them would do so good, would they? Certainly, let me just show you this quote from the Bible. It's no different. In this regard, Quran is no different. Moreover, the literal reading of historical text can hardly tell us how they are understood today, and more importantly, how they are practiced today. Certainly, the literal reading of the US Constitution, for example, can not predict how the US Supreme Court understands it or how we have come to practice it. It's impossible if you are, let's say, living outside of the context of the United States. If you read that text in the Middle East, you would never know what it means. How is it practiced? Besides, no one needs to be an expert in Islam to know that being Muslim means different things to different people in different places in different times. We know that there are so many epistemological, practical differences among them. Besides this, we know that there are so much ethno-nationalistic differences among Muslims. We know, for example, that Iranians have attached to Islam a Persian nationalistic narrative which is specific to them. So in a sense, they have Persianized Islam. And similar thing is true for the Arabs. Arab nationalism is imbued with Sunni nationalism. The same thing with Turkish. Turkish nationalism is Turkishization of Islam or Islamization of Turkishness. The Kurds are the same. Punjabis are the same. Many different ethno-nationalistic groups in the global context of nationalism have, in fact, have nationalized their religion. Pretty much like the way we have Americanized the understanding of Christians. But those differences are, regardless of those differences, the way we have come to understand it, at least the mainstream or most American, is that Islam is this homogeneous idea and Muslims are one people. They're connected together. They're a unified block of people. And here is the irony. On one breath, we talk about that the Muslims are the same because the minute you blame Muslim or anything about Islam, you homogenize. You essentialize Islam. But then on the other hand, we blame him for being fragmented. And it is true. Islam is one of the religions that is decentralized from its very, very beginning. It's never had centralized authority. Never in its history. Except 13 years in its beginning. And there was a local city-state, for God's sake, in Medina. So, with that, we can see, on the one hand, we're blaming for being Muslim, essentializing Islam into one. On the other hand, we say, oh, these people have been fighting each other for 1,000 years. So they are the same. And unfortunate and tragic, in fact, even President Obama last night repeated the same thing. What does that mean that they have been fighting each other for 1,000 years? Who are the fact checkers here? We know this. This is a historical fact. For the last 1,000 years, Europe has been the site, Europe, not the Middle East, has been the site of the most numerous, bloodiest, brutal war all the way until the first half of the 20th century. And we know the 20th century, was the bloodiest century in our human history. And the site of conflict was the West, not the Muslims. So where are the facts here? No facts. It has become naturalized, normalized. And this is why I say it has created a veil for us. And that veil, through that veil, we can't understand, not even ourselves. And I'm afraid that's why I say fascism is close. Because fascism is about appealing to irrational survival mode. And we're already getting close there. And the last, of course, here Islamicization is related to political circles too, obviously. Because the minute we say 1,000 years of war, we're essentializing it. And there is a lot of people that have reinforced that academically. One I can remember, or we can see, is Bernard Lewis. His whole idea is that the Muslims for 1,000 years have not been able to shake off their rage. The title of his book is Islamic Rage. And then on that concept, we have clash of civilization. Samuel Huntington, a very profound and famous political scientist, assumes, and that's his underlying assumption, that Muslims also are unable to liberate themselves from the inherent, deeply embedded cultural traits. They have no, in other words, they have no willpower, agential power to liberate themselves from this so-called Islamic rage. That's why he proposes clash of civilization. And you see that clash of civilization, an inherent, essential Islamic rage, is connected to people who have been writing these things for 40, 50, 60 years. This is the connection between colonialism, imperialism, the media and the think tanks, and obviously the current situation in which we are. And even though there is such a deep, huge, extensive criticism of Huntington and Lewis's in the literature, in the intellectual academic literature, but the media doesn't come to me or Dr. Edquist or other people, Dr. Astana or other people that are familiar with this kind of literature. They go again and again to the disciples of Huntington and Lewis and reinforce this idea. With that, I just want to say one more thing. It's not only academics, even organizations that are, in fact, claiming to be objective and scientific, essentialize Islam. And then, of course, that poison their data. One example is here, an organization called International Studies of, what's the name of it? Anyway. This Washington-based International Terrorism. The organization is a Washington-based think tank called International Terrorism. Its objective, its aim is to collect data, scientific data based on what's going on with number of terrorists. Its only criteria, I would say to you, is that all the terrorists are Muslim. So if you have a Muslim name, you become terrorist. Let's just look at two examples here. Maybe, I think we can't go. Unfortunately, I can't show you the website because here, I can say this. A Muslim guy attacks a Jewish center in 2009. He is categorized as a domestic terrorist. The implication for that, of course, is generation of a national debate of whether the administration has been tough enough or whether our national security has been compromised. Another guy, in fact, attacked another Jewish center for the same political purpose, or he's not the same, but a political purpose. And then he is not called Islamic terrorist. He is called a racist white loner with mental illness. And this is repeated all the time. I don't want to go through too many. And if you look at the category, you can see the only criterion is one being Muslim or having a Muslim name or Islamic name. This is, so, and we repeat that. We see that in political debates among politicians. From this, in other words, I want to summarize this framework. Essentializing Islam does not help us understand Muslims, terrorists, let alone fight it. And of course, at the same time, this takes me to essentializing the West and Western values is as bad. Certainly saying, and some people, even in this country, some of them in the critical studies, always blame the US policies and interventions and Western values and imperialism in and of itself for the cause of terrorism. That's also absurd. That is not to say that imperialist, colonialist policies have not created, and US policies in particular, has not created the conducive conditions in which terrorism is growing, this type of terrorism. That's not to say that, but neither is it to say that just Western policies and brutalities are the cause of terrorism. We know that there are only 40,000 global terrorists at best. That's 40,000 among 1.6 billion Muslims. It's a very tiny number. Moreover, we know there are millions of people, even in this country, that on moral, ethical, practical, human rights issues are anti-imperialist. And in the world, there are billions of them. But do they all go and take the path of terrorism? Certainly not. So with these two, you see that there is a creation of a binary. Either blame all of it on Western values or the West or on Islam. Both are flawed. And we need to take, of course, in this country, the Islam is a whole lot more powerful in the Middle East. Unfortunately, it's the veil of the West. The West is that ambiguous, undefined, underdefined concept that nobody knows what it is, but then again, it is the one that everybody blames. You had a
This
question.
is a good point to kind of bring in audience participation, if that's okay. Yeah. So make sure you write your questions on index cards and give them to people so that we can get them.
Before even doing that, I'm going to drop, because I see that I went a little bit longer than I wanted to. There is another concept I wanted to talk about, domestic terrorism and radicalization, but I leave that for the discussion part.
And so please do that. And then we also have, just to bring down to earth, so to speak, what Majid has been talking about. I think it's important to kind of see sort of the lived experience of this kind of clash of civilization, and then also this kind of rage and this fear. So I want to have our special guest, Ava, from Lewis and Clark, come up here and kind of tell her story about kind of the lived experience of what Majid was talking about. You want to stand here?
Hello? Yeah, that's good. Thank you. At age 3, it was the earliest memory of my being. The only thing that I knew was that my name was Ava. There was no race, religion, stereotype, or judgment attached to my name. The world was pure and innocent in my eyes, and there was no idea of cruelty. Instead, it was simply the world of discovery and the willingness to learn. At age 5, I spoke English. My thoughts were in English. I was surrounded by English. And the only time I would ever speak Farsi was to my mom, and it was such a small amount. My parents immigrated to America from Iran, and they gave me the title of second generation. But I played the same games, understood jokes, and laughed alongside every child who was as American as me. At age 10, I was walking home with one of my best friends. We could talk about everything, and laughing with her was so easy. And as we were crossing the street and she saw my mother waiting for me across the way, she stopped in her spot and she looked at me and asked, "Are you a Muslim?" And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what the word meant. And so out of impulse, I said yes, and she stared into my eyes with a blank face and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm a Christian. My mom and dad said Muslims and Christians aren't allowed to be friends based on history. I'm sorry, we can't ever talk again." And as I went home crying to my parents, it told me that I was blessed to be coming from two different cultures, to be able to view a situation from two different lights, the West and the East. But at the same time, I did not feel blessed. I felt disadvantaged. I did not know what it meant to be a Muslim, but as I looked into the mirror, I saw one. I would see the girl named Ava, who is now a Muslim. At age 12, I walked through the hallways of my middle school as Allahu Akbar was shouted at me as though I was the insurgent with bombs and wires duct taped to my chest, just like the video they saw last night. They feared me, even though I told them my name is not fear, it's just Ava. They felt threatened by me. They would ask me questions about how many wives my dad has, and when I answered one, they would never believe me, as though they knew more about me than I knew about myself. And in that sense, it was true. I did not know I was a terrorist. At age 15, I entered high school with a new form of identity. I never knew I was a Muslim. The societal box was placed around my being, and I was being pushed and pushed to act the way I was supposed to in their eyes. My favorite foods were blamed on my culture, my mistakes were blamed on my religion, my beliefs were blamed on my parents, and my political views were un-American and wrong. It made no difference whether I was born in this country or not, because my skin screams lies about me. At age 17, a girl messaged me and said, "Muslims hate pork, beer, dogs, bikinis, Jesus, and freedom of speech. So what did you come to America for?" She said that she did not believe what she said was racist because the news and history lessons don't lie. At age 17, a boy messaged me and said, "Muslim logic is crazy. They're offended by cartoons and criticism. But yet, they're not offended by rape, slavery, pedophilia, beheadings, suicide bombings, and burning people alive. So tell me, why do all of you people think this way?" No, I am not all of you people. Billions of us are not the them. I will not be put into this generalized box. At age 17, I asked my father if I could go to church. Perhaps if I went to church, I could finally accept the sign that is plastered to my head that says, "You are a Muslim, you are a terrorist, you are a threat." He agreed, and as I walked through those church doors, I felt a second of relief. And as a woman came up to me and asked me what I was doing there, and I said, "To learn," she said, "Church might not be the most fitting for you." I felt rejected by God like I had felt rejected by society. I wanted to stop being a Muslim and start being me. At age 17, I was able to witness Islamophobia sweeping this nation as certain politicians fed on the fears of the people as though trying to rev them up for battle. Muslims need to be ID'd. Incoming Muslims need to be banned. Mosques should be monitored. Muslims should be kicked out. Welcome to the land of the free. At age 17, I am a Muslim. I've never read the Quran. I've never followed traditions. But I do not need to do these things to understand that Muslims are human too. I am a Muslim, therefore I am human, just like I am anything else. At age 17, I do not want to live in a world where I must worry about the color of my children's skin just in case we haven't taken action yet, and they must experience pains in their lives. At age 17, I worry about our futures. We must take action. We are all Muslim. We are all human. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Follow
it's
that.
hard to follow. I think one thing Ava brought up, I think that's really important, and it's just one of the many things. You mentioned, I think several times, my skin screams lies about me, right? So I don't know, I know this is a hard question, but maybe we pretty much have to address it, right? So how can we respond to that different people's skin, scream lies to them, right? How can we try to start addressing that aspect? I don't know, this is maybe a difficult question, but I think it definitely has a lot to do with fear, right? I mean, since you mentioned fear, you're mentioning, truth and lies, this is, I think, the crucial thing I think that we need to think about. How can, in a setting of fear, how can something like skin, start telling lies, and how can we respond to that? I mean, we can't, provide any solutions and say we just do this and then things will be solved. But I think we can at least start thinking about that.
It is very much related to the discussion that we have. It is not the skin itself, because we know that even now, as we speak, there are different contexts where different countries, it's not just the skin. It may be religion, all the same skin, or tribe, or names, or many, many of other aspects. In this country, and the background of colonialism is so deeply embedded in the idea of racism, the white man burden. It got connected. And that politicization still haunts us in this country. But we know that human beings have the ability not to see the skin the way we have politicized it. So in order to depoliticize the skin, obviously, we have to have democracy. And democracy is the right or the space in which people learn to recognize the others, not necessarily not at all, based on their physical features. But that's not the case. That's not the case. And in this country, of course, we see that more and more identity politics, that is ethnic, racist politics, is becoming the instrument of getting to the seat of power. And it is so dangerous because this is exactly what happened, as I said, in Germany. And it is still happening now in Germany. And it is happening in America. And these are the places that we hope, and they have the potential and the means and the knowledge and the intellectual background and history that can contribute to democracy. This is up to us. I think the choice is clear. Where do we want to go? Do we want to go and live under a security surveillance state, which is closer? Call it fascism, call it security state, call it anything you want. Who cares? But one cannot reconcile a security state with a democratic state. And more, most of our resources are over security and securitization and militarization and on and on and on. And it is time. It's time. And of course, by the way, this is not to say the people might, even in this audience, I sympathize with them, from somebody who's kind of has the ability and flexibility to switch from one lens to another. I certainly feel for all the illegal aliens. I am an illegal alien in a sense. I always announce that. Like Ava says, I am a Muslim, but I'm not. I sympathize and understand that. I'm also that white old man that is afraid that the black's gonna come and take over his neighborhood. I certainly understand Dylan Roof, the guy in South Carolina that went into a black church and killed 9 people and injured many. As he was shooting his victims, what did he say? He says, you guys, you people are raping our women. You're invading our country. You have to go. You have to go. So if I understand the question correctly, and it's a great question, can nationalism, or under the context of nation-state nationalism, can it be peaceful? I believe yes and no. This is a very complex issue. We know that nationalism in certain ways has existed all the time. Maybe we call it tribal identities, ethnic nationalism. People tend to be closer to the people that are closest to them, physically, in the way of language, culture, understanding. There's nothing wrong with that. But politicizing it into the term that I talked about, hyper-nationalism, which is the idea of exclusion, certainly is not productive. And in fact, in this country, to the credit of millions of great Americans, we understand this concept so beautifully. We understand it in the sense that America is not about a particular race or religion or ideas even. This we understand intellectually, but in practice, we are more and more deviating from it. Because political prostitutes, and I really mean it, they are, in fact, shaping the consciousness and the conversation of the country. And this has been happening for too long. Yes, of course you can be, as you said, have some sense of closeness to Uganda. There's nothing wrong with it. And as you know and you experience it, there's nothing wrong with it to be an American. I feel the same way. And places that I go, a whole lot of times, I identify with them. Yeah. Yeah. But if I may interrupt here just one, and then you can go on. In order to make a conversation productive, we must stay on the topic. What you're saying is a beautiful discussion for the idea of nationalism, globalization, world order, and all of that. But we have a very short time to talk about how we understand terrorism and how we come to understand terrorism. And I think if we focus, and your question, it's not like it's not related, but I think if we, if you walk on that path, we are going to lose, we're going to go away from the topic. And that's my feeling, but please go ahead.
Maybe if I can, make one comment, and then I'll try to go to the questions. I hope there are more. I think I saw more people with index cards. I have a pretty small sample here. But one thing I think that's really, since I invoked Martin Luther King in the beginning, I think it might be worthwhile sort of coming back to him, because he said a lot of important things about nation and other things, but his focus was on community, right? So when you're mentioning nation, you're actually just talking about a relatively larger, partly imagined community, right? And so like any community, or, we know that that community can include many differences, right? Can include many different groups. And in some cases, that community can both feel like home and then also include, or sort of be a place where we can actually encounter across these differences, right? So the point is, community can be based on us versus them, which is what Majid largely talked about. But at the same time, community can also be where we learn to actually meet across differences, where we learn to sort of respond to what Ava said, not have, just to scream, sort of tell lies about that person, right? And so I don't think it's productive to say we should all become cosmopolitans as opposed to nation-oriented. It depends. Cosmopolitanism can be just as vilifying, can also lead, as King said, to co-annihilation, right? And any community, whether it's small or national or larger, has that kind of choice that we have to make, right? How are we going to respond to the other, and that will lead, towards, coexistence or co-annihilation. So I think that big question of coexistence and co-annihilation is really, yeah.
Between this idea, the liberal idea of multiculturalism, the idea that we all can live together. But the consequences of that multiculturalism, in fact, in practical terms, not its theory, theory is fine, has been fragmentation of communities. And let me just make this example of a terrorist. His name is Iftikhar Jamal, a British-born citizen. He went with his buddies, 6 of them, to Syria, and he died in 2014 or 13. His story is not unsimilar to many hundreds of other stories of terrorism. And it shows that he lacks the community. Let me just say a few things about him. First, he was alienated from the community, both Muslims and Christians, British and these cosmopolitan areas. Did you show that picture of Iftikhar? No, I guess you didn't. But anyway, this guy got online, became friend in a Harry Potter fan club. From the fan club, they were seduced to, or they went to Syria. His fantasy of Islam was very much influenced by Harry Potter fantasies. He honestly thought that he is one of those heroes in a fantastical theater, acting out as the hero, the master hero that is fighting all these monsters. And the monsters for him became the West. He was so uninformed, he didn't know what the West meant. And we know that many of these terrorists, domestic and also global, they really are uninformed by Islamic theory, Islamic history, Islamic scholarship, Western scholarship. academic, social, and others. So this is one of the problems that we have now, even in this country. We don't have communities with community values. Yes, we talk about this consumerist, multiculturalist, everybody is somebody. But this fragmentation, and again, Jamal, his world was virtual. All of his friends, until he went to Syria, were virtual friends online. He learned Islam online from his friends. And this is the pattern that we see in hundreds of cases. Hundreds of cases. So you see that it really depends on us again. It's a little bit more complex and how to deal with it. Solutions are always more difficult. In this topic, I try to, in fact, say what the problems are. I'm not an expert to know what the solutions are. But that's really.
Just go to some of the audience questions, and I don't think we can probably address all of them, but I think here are a couple or maybe 3 questions that kind of get at a similar theme, which is really looking at the question, the problem that you're posing, really more from the perspective of people living in so-called Muslim countries, right? So one question is, if we perceive races differently in regards to whether it is really domestic terrorism or lone acts, how do Middle Eastern countries perceive terrorist acts between U.S. military and radical groups? And then also, I think a similar or associated questions, how do Muslims around the world perceive the homogenizing of Muslim religion within the U.S. and Western societies? So I don't know if that's a question that you can address, but I think it is important to look at it,
Question, and that's the idea that how do Middle Eastern states are dealing with terrorists, right? Pretty much the same way we do. In fact, sometimes more brutal, always almost, more brutal and as uninformed. Because most of the Middle East tyrants pretty much learn their lessons, the policing lessons, in a wrong way too, in sometimes, from the US security surveillance state. Saudi Arabia is a great case. They have promoted, intentionally and unintentionally, promoted the literal reading of Islam and promoted and provoked sectarian violence. They used Islam as the tool to empower themselves and remain in power. While they have done that, now that the chickens have come home to roost, they want to fight it. They want to fight it very brutally. It was only 2-3 weeks ago when they beheaded 47. 43 of them were accused of terrorism. They're dealing with it in a very brutal, savage way and uninformed by the conditions they have helped create. Again, here I'm not saying that the Saudi Arabian regime, certainly not its people, is responsible for it directly. But they have created, again, the conducive conditions in which terrorism has arisen. It's a political, socio-political phenomenon, and we have to see that. So they're dealing it, unfortunately, they're dealing with it pretty much the same way. And this is the tragedy of our globalized existence.
A question, and also very, I think, personal, but I think it also points to how what Majid and what we've been talking about, this is not a comfortable subject, right? It's going to disrupt. I mean, that's why I refer to fearless speech, and fearless speech is almost per definition can cause people, to perhaps even become angry or at least oppose what we're saying. So here, one question. Sorry, Sean, as someone whose father died in World War II, whose stepfather was career Air Force and fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, whose son is in a National Guard unit and served 9 months in Afghanistan, I see value in drones as a strategy. Deployment of any military weapons have always caused collateral damage to civilian populations. I prefer drones to my son's body. I believe that Obama expresses his personal responsibility by being physically present to launching drones. I stand as a pacifist, opposing all war. It's obviously a very complex, I'm not sure about the last one, a complex issue. So I think just the, I don't know if you can respond to that.
Question, I'm sorry, whoever is, here, let me just be frank. And the question has contradiction in it. You can't be a pacifist and not liking war, and then liking a technology of assassinating people virtually and glorifying it as a way or means to fight terrorism. This we know. Let's look at the empirical evidence. Let's put our emotional attachment to something aside. And this is how it's very difficult to get out of our own nationalistic narrative. We know that there are more terrorists today than 2001. This we know. There are more terrorist attacks, and the whole Middle East is on fire on that. So what happened? Can we not question that some of these methods are not really fighting terrorism, but creating them? That is not to say that the people that their job is in the military or police. That has anything to do with them. I never even focus in my discussion on that. My focus in the use of military and how we politicize something or depoliticize it, securitize it or not. Otherwise, the services that many of the servicemen are providing for the country, it's a political decision. I can't be emotionally attached that whether my father or my brother or this or that or the other. It has personal value, but it doesn't have political value in that sense. And in this talk, at least from my own personal perspective, I would never, ever want to dehumanize or demonize the personnel. That's stupid, unproductive. It's essentializing against something. But we are talking about a larger question here, the question of where we want to be. We ought to remember that this country didn't have an organized military the way we have a standing army for a long, long time. We didn't have it. I'm not saying, like I said, I have no idea. I'm not an expert. I'm not expressing my opinion whether we should have it or not. That is not the question on the table. But the question on the table is how to fight terrorism. And my contention is, and I may not be right, first let's understand it. And understanding it is not by looking at how we kill them. In practical terms, it hasn't produced good results. And that's actually President Obama mentioned yesterday, in a way, saying that I am really tough. Ask bin Laden. Now we have many, many more bin Ladens. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Syria. I'd rather just change him. I'm already missing bin Laden. He wasn't as brutal. And even his replacement, Zawahiri, if you read his speech, oh my God, he's criticizing ISIS. In some respect, he says, you say, oh my God, this is the lesser of two evils. So we haven't moved forward. This is not a military question, obviously, right? But we militarize it again.
I think the droning brings up many other interesting aspects as well. So we might think from our perspective that drones, if we don't have to send our sons, daughters, our citizens into harm's way, it seems like we're saving lives, right? So that's on the one hand, and that's a pretty amazing thing to think about, but in a way, drones allow you to do that. They allow you to take a distance, literally a distance from what you're doing, and you don't have to see what's being done when the bombs drop. But it's interesting, this is not just a physical thing, right? We don't have to see the bombs drop and see what happens down in the villages below. We actually mentally can also remove ourselves from it. So we don't have to see the deaths that are involved when the bombs do drop, and we don't see it, but it happens, right? And then at the same time, we might think, oh, at least my son or daughter or friend, at least they come home alive and safe, right? But you don't have to, if you look at psychological studies that are actually out there, people who are involved in drone warfare, it affects them deeply psychologically, right? So their body might be alive, but are they really healthy, right? Are they really, complete human beings in that sense, right? So I think that's one really important thing to think about with the drones. And another thing, you mentioned about fear-mongering, and we often talk about media and how the media, constructs our realities, and we even like to kind of maybe at least be tempted to kind of put a lot of blame or a lot of responsibility on the media. But drones, they're bombs that drop. But obviously, if I'm a 5-year-old going to bed in the evening, right? I actually just read before I got here, parents actually tell their kids, if you don't go to sleep, the drones might drop bombs. They actually use it as a threat. So it's so much part of their everyday lives that it has a huge impact on fear, right? So it's not only media. Drones are both, obviously, bombs dropping, killing bodies, but just think of the impact on the mentality of the people there.
We have talked about already is this conversation shapes our consciousness of what we think is really violent or not. The whole idea that saving ours and reducing the cost of death to us versus them, their lives are not worth grieving for or identifying. It's really important. This is a huge thing about othering that I was talking about. That premise that, it's really not important so long as I am not death. Right there and then, this tells you that you are in a mode of survival. You're no longer thinking of as the globe and humanity as human beings. You already dehumanized them by the very saying it, the very phrase that we frame it, because it's, again, instrumentalization of human beings. If we were, I would submit to you here, if we were to fight terrorism, the first thing would be for us to recognize the death and injuries of others and grieve for them. We know how upset we were in Paris attack, in San Bernardino, and others. It's so totally justifiable. But if we lose the context that in the same week of, let's say, Paris attack, as many people died in terrorist attacks in Baghdad, Lebanon, and not even counting Syria and Istanbul, then we would say, there is something wrong with our lenses. How is it that 50, 60 leaders of the world come to Paris to grieve justifiably for the death of all of those people? Justifiably. But nobody sees what happened. It's totally ignored. Isn't this exactly the idea that their lives do not matter? We just don't. This is a political thing. Or are we? This is what we call epistemic violence. We just don't know the violence of our own actions. It's in the discourse itself. And we have to recognize that.
I think maybe, I don't know if did you have a question? Or maybe I thought I saw your hand up. Okay. Maybe one, and time is running out, but I think, you have a question?
Yeah.
In the back? Okay. I don't know if there's
Thank you so much. No, I understand. I understand the question now. In other words, let me reframe it. do Muslim cultures, whatever that means, which is cultures maybe, are they blame also? Should they be looking at the problem that exists? Obviously. That wasn't the topic of my conversation, certainly. And I'm not glorifying or any way justifying the many tyrannical, dictatorial contexts in which this disease has grown and spread. And I am certainly not holding the people in local instances responsible. What I'm not saying is that the Islamic community, if there is such a thing, as if there are Muslims at night and they can call each other every night and they speak to each other in the same language. Oh boy, did you know what happened today? It was good for us. Or they are somehow institutionalized under some sort of mysterious organization. That's stupid. But on the other extreme of it, it's also stupid to say that they have no human will. And that was the conversation I was saying, that only 40,000 have taken the walk of use of random violence for their political purposes. And obviously I'm saying this doesn't represent all of Muslims, but I am holding them responsible for it. And for holding each person responsible. And I'm holding you guys and us, that's how Sean started, responsible for where we're going from here. We are responsible for our act. And my first step, if we want to fight terrorism, more than bombs and bombing and alliances with dictators and all the dictators of the Middle East, first we have to understand ourselves and save our democracy. So in that sense, I really emphasize on the willpower and human agency, the freedom of the people, in a sense, to think about it. Because, of course, my rationale was that it's irrelevant. It is irrelevant to take a quote. That's why I showed the Bible quote. Similar quotes are hundreds of them, tens of them, are in Quran. It's irrelevant to understand today's norm of Christians by looking at the text. It's pretty much the same as looking at Quranic and sacred text. My argument is rejection of comparing and evaluating spiritual understanding of Islam or literal understanding of Islam or Sharia laws based on what's written in text. This is my argument. So it doesn't go, I know many Muslims would say, oh no, this is the word of truth, the ultimate truth and nothing but the truth. And isn't that what the evangelists say in this country? This is the book of truth. I don't buy that, I'm sorry. I'm not saying it's untruth, I'm saying that, listen, let's just put that on side and look at practices of the day and focus on human agencies. But also, with all due respect, my friend, this is exactly what I was arguing against. Essentializing Islam or Christianity or the West, for whatever it is essentially problematic. Because you cannot glorify one thing by demonizing the other. You cannot say democracy, which is a very, very modern, practical thing, is rooted or was imagined or predicted by any sacred text. But we know this, that every nation in the world has that imagination of itself. I know for a fact, in my book, Imagining Iran, I write a lot about this idea, that the Persian nationalists, in fact, invent this idea that they were the one who invented the idea of human rights. Human rights didn't exist 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago, but they really truly claim it. And the president of of Iran, in every occasion that he gets a chance, even when he comes to United Nations, that's why I say fact checkers. There are none. They invoke the idea, oh, Persians, yeah. And if there were any Persian Iranians here, perhaps they would catch me outside and say, you know what, you insulted my country, my beliefs. I really think that we need to take our lenses off a little bit, be open-minded about what is and what's not. That is not to demonize any religion, but let's not glorify it either. Let's not. Anyway, I made my argument about the Constitution of the United States. Why? Because the Constitution of the United States doesn't have that normative value attached to it. And I said we cannot, if you take the Constitution if you could go back in time, none of the constitutionalists would possibly predict that corporations are people in today's understanding, right? It's pretty much the same.
So I'm afraid time is running out. But okay, there's always one more question. So it's okay. Okay, go ahead. Can I respond?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, if I can respond, I think that's a really important issue. But again, it's not quite so simple in terms of, do we value only our own, or do we value everybody equally, right? Obviously, it's very hard for us to value everybody equally. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't value everybody, at least to the level where we grieve their deaths, right? So I think that whose life is grievable, that's actually of course, it's a question asked by a famous philosopher, so I'm not making it up myself, but it's a very important question to ask, right? Because it doesn't mean, whose life do we care about intimately. It'd be pretty impossible for me to care intimately about 7 billion people, but that's no excuse to sort of just go back to my own little clan and only care about them. Do you see what I mean? So it's not either or, but it's about thinking about how can we learn to grieve for people that we actually don't know. And to really do that, things like, Ava's story of lived experiences, those are very important, right? Because they come from a very particular context, right? And that's a context in the United States, in Spokane, kind of our own context. Obviously, at some level, I think we need to learn to do the same in terms of listening and paying attention to the stories of lived experiences elsewhere, right? We might not be able to care for them the same we care about, let's say, our own family and our own friends, but we can learn to then grieve for their lives, right? And so, yeah, go ahead.
It is true, and I agree with that. I believe that this 40,000 or whatever, they're there because we have failed. We have failed in two senses. Yes, I agree with you. This is a moral failure, which is related to not being able to see the conditions of these other countries, instrumentalizing them, in a sense, and their people. On another failure, which my focus of talk was, is the failure to, in fact, even deal with it for our own interest, or in our own interest. This is the big, huge dilemma for us here. Because what I was arguing, and I didn't really get to the end, what I was arguing is that fighting terrorism has implication for democracy, yes. But that's simple to say. That also means the logic of terrorism and fascism and Nazism and securitization and militarization and politicization, in fact, is dominating our context. In the end, what it means is that if we fail to understand and deal with this correctly, with a moral compass, I think it's going to come to haunt us. Otherwise, we could pretty much say, like what Donald Trump said, let's say just pack all the 3 million Muslims in this country if we can. Pack them. And just put them out of the country. Let's say it's done. Let's say it's done. Or the 11 million illegal immigrants, pack them up, put them outside of the border. Let's not even care about them for just a moment. Will that make the country a better country? Certainly not. Then it's not going to be those 3 million people or 11 million people or a neighborhood. Then it's going to be somebody else. Because that state, the imperative of a security state is to have enemies. And that's the logic of governance. So you see, even from a practical sort of approach, fighting terrorism the way we have been fighting it is unproductive, in my opinion.
Unless there are other questions, I think that really, always more questions. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, yeah, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great comment, actually. It's not a question, but it is in fact true. Because we know that the idea of, let's say, what you invoke, Black Lives Matter, the intention was not that human lives don't matter. The idea was that, hey, guys, watch, look at us. It seems that you're treating us as if our lives don't matter. Many millions of people in the Middle East are saying that. They say, yes, we know that you want to kill the terrorists. We want to help you. But bombing us is not going to help. They don't hear it. They don't hear it. They, by they, I mean these political prostitutes. And they want it, they don't, just like in this country, this great country in so many senses, we still have the debate on whether Black lives matters or not. That's out of the question. In practical terms, it doesn't matter. They have been treated as if their lives do not matter as much. In every sense, why don't we deal with that reality? We don't deal with it. Of course, it's a political issue, in my opinion. And pretty much the same thing with dealing with the Middle East. Essentializing, say, these guys been fighting for 1,000 years. Let's just leave them alone. They're going to fight for the next 1,000 years. What? They have no agency on their own, and we can't do nothing about it. It's like tornadoes. There's nothing you can do about it.
I think your question really brings up another really important point, which is that neither Majid nor I nor any of us, at the end of the day, can speak for the other in many ways. So I think the Black Lives Matter, what it represents is people seeing Black lives, under threat and discriminated and violated. They're the ones that stand up and say Black Lives Matter. Do you see? So I think that's a really important part. If we think about our response, again, we can go to the media, or we should read Martin Luther King. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters, right? Who stands up and says, this life matters. That's the most important. But then obviously, for anybody to be able to speak up, just like with Black Lives Matter, people do have to listen, right? We are social beings. So I think at best, what we can do here is not tell people what to think, and not speaking for them, but listening to, especially moments when they do stand up and speak, if that makes sense.
I think we exhausted this time. I really appreciate, especially those of you who stayed.
Maybe one last thing. One last thing I
I
want to
got to go
mention.
to a class at 2 o'clock.
No, one
You know,
last thing
so-
I want to mention. I mean, the fact that there are questions left, I think in many ways, how we respond to this issue really leads to sort of hopefully the next panel. So I'm hoping, that we can continue this conversation. And also any questions that you have, feel free to address those and come talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.